The wedding hall was decorated like something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a golden glow over the silk-draped tables and the endless sea of flowers. Guests, dressed in the finest designer attire, whispered among themselves as they waited for the ceremony to begin. It was supposed to be the perfect day, the kind of wedding people would talk about for years. But instead, something happened that no one would ever forget. Malik stood at the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent his entire life working for this moment, proving himself worthy of the woman he loved. Naomi was everything to him, his best friend, his soulmate, the woman he had dreamed of building a future with. He had never once doubted her love for him, never questioned the promises they had made to each other. But that was before she walked away. Gasps filled the room as Naomi, still in her stunning white gown, turned her back on the altar. Her expression was unreadable, her lips pressed together in a tight line as she avoided his gaze. Malik felt his world shift, confusion twisting into something darker. "Naomi," he breathed, his voice barely audible over the murmurs in the room. "What are you doing?" She hesitated, just for a second, but it was long enough for Malik to see the truth in her eyes. "I can't do this," she finally said, her voice soft yet firm. "I'm sorry, Malik." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The room spun, his hands clenched into fists as he tried to process what was happening. He had given her everything, his heart, his trust, his future. And yet, here she was, leaving him in front of everyone. Her father stepped forward then, placing a hand on her shoulder. Malik's stomach twisted. He had always known Mr. Davenport never approved of him. He had heard the whispers, the not-so-subtle reminders that he would never be good enough for a woman like Naomi. But he had convinced himself that love was stronger than money, that what he and Naomi had built was unbreakable. He had been wrong. Naomi didn't say another word. She simply turned and walked away, her veil trailing behind her like a ghost of the future they were supposed to have. Malik stood there, frozen, humiliation burning through him as the whispers grew louder. He wanted to scream, to demand an answer, but deep down, he already knew. She had chosen her family's wealth and status over him. And in that moment, something inside him changed. He walked out of that hall with nothing, not his pride, not his love, not even a shred of the life he had planned. But as he stepped into the cold night air, one thought consumed him. This wasn't the end. Years later, he would return. And when he did, the world that had once looked down on him would never see him the same way again. Malik walked away that night with his heart shattered, but he refused to let the pain consume him. He had spent years believing in love, thinking it was the most powerful force in the world. But that night, as Naomi chose wealth and status over their bond, he learnt a lesson that would shape the rest of his life. Love wasn't enough. Power mattered. Success mattered. And if the world didn't think he was good enough, he would make sure they had no choice but to respect him. The next few months were the hardest of his life. He left town, cutting all ties with the world he once knew. There were nights he barely slept, days when he didn't know where his next meal would come from. But he didn't complain. Every struggle became fuel for his ambition. He worked multiple jobs, saving every penny, learning everything he could about business and investments. He refused to let bitterness take over. He wasn't trying to prove Naomi wrong. He was proving himself right. Years passed, and Malik transformed into someone unrecognizable. He had built a real estate empire from nothing, making strategic moves that turned him into one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. He learned how to walk into a room and command attention, how to speak with authority so that no one would ever doubt his worth again. He no longer needed validation from anyone, least of all from the people who once looked down on him. But fate had a way of bringing the past back when least expected. One evening, Malik attended an exclusive charity gala, an event filled with the elite CEOs, politicians, socialites. He was there for business, not socializing, but as he moved through the crowd, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. It was Naomi. She stood near the bar, looking just as stunning as the last time he had seen her. But something was different. The confidence in her posture wasn't the same, and the sparkle in her eyes had dimmed. She was smiling, but it didn't reach her face. She looked lost. Malik's instincts told him to ignore her, to walk past like she meant nothing to him. But a part of him, the part that still carried, the ghost of the man he used to be, wanted her to see him, to see what she had walked away from. As if sensing his presence, Naomi turned, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them moved. Recognition flickered in her expression, followed by something he couldn't quite place: shock, regret, maybe even admiration. "Malik?" she finally whispered, disbelief clear in her voice. He smiled, but it wasn't the boyish grin she once knew. It was the smile of a man who had conquered his demons. "Naomi," he said smoothly, raising his glass. "It's been a long time." The tension between them was palpable, the weight of the past pressing down on them. Naomi's fingers tightened around her clutch as she studied him. She looked like she wanted to say something, but before she could, a man approached her, a well-dressed, older gentleman with greying hair. Her husband. Malik didn't need an introduction to know who he was. He had done his research long ago. Charles Sinclair, a wealthy businessman nearly 2 decades older than Naomi. The man her father had approved of. The man she had chosen over him. "Darling, are you ready to go?" Charles asked, placing a firm hand on her lower back. Naomi hesitated, her eyes flickering between Malik and her husband. "Just a minute," she murmured. Malik took a sip of his drink, watching the silent exchange between them. He could tell by the stiffness in Naomi's shoulders, the way she avoided Charles's gaze, that something wasn't right. "You've done well for yourself," she finally said, her voice softer now. "I've heard your name everywhere." Malik tilted his head slightly. "I had to make something of myself, didn't I?" His words were polite, but the meaning behind them was clear. Naomi swallowed hard, nodding. "You did." There was so much left unsaid between them, an entire history wrapped up in one moment. But before either of them could say more, Charles cleared his throat, his patience wearing thin. "We should be going," he said pointedly. Naomi gave Malik one last look, something unreadable in her eyes, before turning and walking away. Malik watched her go, a part of him wondering if she had truly gotten everything she wanted. But he didn't dwell on it. This was just the beginning. And soon, she would learn that walking away from him had been the biggest mistake of her life. Malik watched as Naomi disappeared into the crowd with her husband. The encounter had stirred something in him, but it wasn't regret. It was clarity. He had spent years chasing success, proving to himself that he was more than the man she had left behind. Now, standing at the peak of his achievements, he realized he no longer needed validation from anyone, especially not from Naomi. Yet fate wasn't done with them just yet. A week after the gala, Malik received an unexpected invitation. It was for an exclusive business conference, one that brought together the most powerful investors and CEOs. He rarely attended such events, unless there was something to gain. But his assistant mentioned something that caught his attention. Charles Sinclair would be one of the keynote speakers. When Malik arrived at the event, he quickly noticed the tension in the room. The whispers weren't about him, but about Charles. There were rumors of financial troubles, bad investments, and a crumbling empire. It seemed that the once mighty businessman was losing his grip. Malik listened without reacting, though deep down, he knew exactly what this meant. As the evening progressed, he spotted Naomi standing alone in a quiet corner of the ballroom. Unlike the radiant bride he once knew, she now seemed distant, lost in thought. When she finally noticed him, she hesitated before approaching. "Malik," she said softly, her voice carrying a vulnerability he hadn't expected. "Naomi," he acknowledged, his expression unreadable. She exhaled slowly, searching his face as if looking for something familiar. "You must have heard about Charles," she said. Malik gave a small nod. "People talk." She bit her lip, her eyes darting away before meeting his again. "He's in trouble, Malik. He's made some bad deals, and now it's all falling apart." He studied her carefully. There was no pride in her voice, no attempt to hide the reality of her situation. "And what about you?" he asked. She hesitated, then sighed. "I thought I was making the right choice back then. I thought love would come later, that security mattered more than anything else. She looked down. But I was wrong. Malik remained silent, letting her words settle. He had once imagined this moment, the day she would realize what she had lost. But now that it was happening, it didn't bring the satisfaction he had expected. He had already moved on, built a life that no longer revolved around the past. Charles will be looking for investors to save his company, Naomi admitted, her voice quieter now. I know you have the power to change everything for him, or to let it fall. There it was, the unspoken question. Would he help the man who had once looked down on him, the man who had taken Naomi away? Malik let out a slow breath, then gave her a small smile. Business is business, Naomi, and I don't make deals based on the past. Her face fell slightly, but she nodded, as if she had expected that answer. That night, Malik attended the investors' meeting, where Charles made his desperate pitch. His voice lacked the confidence it once had, and it was clear he knew he was losing control. When the time came for Malik to speak, he stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and looked directly at Charles. I admire persistence, he said calmly. But in business, just like in life, choices have consequences. The room fell silent as his words sank in. He didn't need revenge. Life had already taken care of that. Charles's empire crumbled within weeks. Malik didn't interfere, nor did he extend a hand to help. Naomi, now free from the wealth she had once prioritized, faced a new reality. But she didn't beg, didn't ask for anything more. Their final exchange had been enough for her to understand she had made her choice, and so had Malik. As Malik walked away that night, he felt lighter than he had in years. He had once thought he needed to prove something to the world. But now, standing at the height of his success, he knew the truth. He had never needed Naomi's approval. He had never needed to prove his worth to anyone. And that was the greatest victory of all.